Thank you very much. And I'm going to basically speak under these headings. This is a series of papers that are going to be published as a book under the broad heading of the Industrial Policy Commission for Task. So everything I'm going to say here is going to be very brief, and it's going to be introductory, and all these papers are going to be up on the Task website and ultimately be published as a book. The projected publication date is now November, and there's no reason why this shouldn't be achieved. And a lot of this material is available, so therefore no great need for me to go into detail. The first thing I want to say, what is industrial policy? Basically, I want to say industrial policy is something that really was a rude word under the neoliberal perspective until quite recently, around the time of the financial collapse, when people like Stiglitz and others have come along with arguments that, hey, we've got to revive the idea of an industrial policy and to be seriously and reasonably interventionist in our perspectives on what can be done by subtly introducing policies that encourage economic development. Industrial policy in this context meaning not just industry, i.e. manufacturing, but also service development and so on. So what we're talking about is a series of policies that can generate development around concepts like accumulation of knowledge and capabilities, both at the level of individuals and organizations. So that's the broad introduction of what we mean by industrial policy. And then what we have done is we've asked a series of experts in different fields to write papers in their fields relating to industrial policy. What I'm going to do in this presentation is just tell you what each of these papers says in very brief headline outline. So the first paper I'm going to talk about is that of Professor Emeritus, who is the Professor of Industrial Sociology at Maynooth. And what he underlines very clearly and emerging from the new definitions of a new industrial policy is the need for development of organizational capabilities. That is, around the notions of institutions in Ireland and relationships that have developed, for example, between individual firms and agencies of the state and state policies to incorporate that learning in ways of developing small indigenous firms in Ireland, taking into consideration the fact that small indigenous firms in Ireland are generally speaking not high-tech, they're low and medium tech, but have a huge amount to contribute even under the heading of innovation, and have done so and can continue to do so through appropriate assistance. And the Minister's announcement of the 6 billion is the kind of thing that Sean has been calling for, and is a kind of positive element of what we might take from the Minister's speech. The importance of finance, and particularly state financial contribution to indigenous industrial development is a point made firmly by Sean in his paper. Okay, so that's the first of the papers. And again, if you want to ask me questions later, I'll do my best to answer. I've read and edited all the papers, but have to emphasize that these are individual efforts of the individual writers of each of them. Next paper, I don't have to say too much about, because if you want to ask Paul, he's here and can answer himself. What Paul does is to look at the existence of a kind of industrial policy around the notion of following the money. That is, where is money spent by the state and state agencies in Ireland on the development of the private sector? And what emerges is that there's a total amount of somewhere between 4 and over 6 billion of such expenditure being undertaken by the state in all ways through departmental and agency expenditure, including tax expenditure. That is reduction of tax in order to incentivize certain activities by companies. And the key issue that emerges from the paper is that there's a huge amount of analysis to be done to justify lots of this expenditure. And when budgets are being developed by the Irish government to reduce this or other taxation in order to encourage this or that development, it is in general politically determined rather than carefully analytically determined through whatever analysis can be undertaken economically or financially. So that is, so if you take the broad outline of Sean's paper being that industrial policy is complex, the next paper by Paul suggests, well, if you follow the money, you can see where it's going, but there's very little consolidation or strategy evident in this expenditure of the 4 to 6 billion. Next paper is by Jim Stewart, and I need to say very little about this because Jim is also here, and he's going to talk about this in much greater detail in his keynote talk, which follows this session that we're having at the moment. I'll simply say very briefly, because he's going to talk in much greater length about it, that the issue is not, it seems to me from his paper, the rate, but rather the nature of the regulations that surround taxation, namely what we allow companies to do, broadly speaking, in where they declare their taxes. So there's no doubt that the Irish tax regime has some characteristics of a tax haven, whether or not you define it as a tax haven. The next paper is by me, and so I can talk in more detail about this, having written it, and also can answer any questions anybody wants to ask about this issue. What I'm arguing in my paper in this Industrial Policy Commission is that innovation and technological development are both extremely important, but they are not the same thing. That is, when we think about innovation in general, what we do think about is R&D, the expenditure on R&D, and we think, that's great, we're spending on R&D, therefore we're spending on innovation. This is not so. And what we really have to do is get away from that and think about the fact that there are many, many firms and many, many sectors and subsectors that are undertaking huge amounts of innovation, but none of that innovation is financed by R&D. It is learning by doing. It is subtly adjusting industrial development processes. It is on-the-line production being adjusted. It is some worker thinking about doing something better. It is about service sectors organizing logistics better, and so on. Huge amounts of things that are not patentable, that are not financed by R&D, and that can have a huge impact when carefully and correctly supported by state agencies on employment and development. So, this is an extremely important thing that requires a huge amount of analysis at the subsectoral level particularly, and arguably also around the idea of organizational capability and networking. This is to underline the point that Sean makes in his paper, and in particular to say things like groups of firms where each learns from others and develop complementarity in industrial development, and including such things as development of marketing and the marketing of products and processes in export markets is a part of this whole argument. The next paper that I want to talk about here is Owen O'Malley's, and that is an extremely interesting analytical paper on the question of multinational corporations and Irish firms and their relative contributions, both in terms of manufacturing, manufacturing and services. And basically what he does in this paper is to look at those four things, if you like, indigenous and foreign-owned, manufacturing and services. And what emerges from this analysis, I think, is extremely interesting, because the accepted wisdom is that Ireland has collapsed over the period since 2000 in terms of its competitiveness. But how Owen defines competitiveness is not to look at more or less spurious indicators like wage rates when you're trying to identify the nature of Irish competitiveness, but rather to look at the maintenance of shares of export markets. And in looking at that, what emerges is that this accepted wisdom of collapse in competitiveness for the Irish economy is just completely wrong. Ireland has actually maintained its competitiveness quite well throughout the period since 2000, but it actually varies quite a lot as between foreign and indigenous firms and as between manufacturing and services. Quite an interesting and sophisticated conceptual idea of redefining competitiveness and looking at the consequences of that redefinition for what we can say about Irish competitiveness. And the answers are not what you'd expect. And finally, and this is my last slide, we have a paper on sustainability by Rachel Healy. And again, this talks closely to the notion of industrial policy and basically says the following. Whereas you would normally argue, if you were a traditional economist, that policies to encourage sustainability and to prevent pollution reduce your competitiveness because it increases your costs. In fact, that's wrong. When you encourage rigorous and careful inspection of environmental protection policies, what you do actually is you incentivize better performance. It's almost like an alternative to high levels of competition. You encourage better performance by otherwise polluting companies. And by so doing, you increase competitiveness of companies in the country with high levels of tight environmental protection. And this has been tested quite closely on the pharmaceutical sector and found to be correct. So, the argument goes one step further and says, what we need is this very tight environmental protection regime, because that will encourage industrial development in Ireland of organizations, including firms that otherwise pollute, as well as encouraging the capabilities, the accumulation of capabilities mentioned by so many of others that I've already mentioned, as ways of incorporating that efficient production of non-polluting products and byproducts as a future for the development of Ireland. And with that, I'll end, and I'm available to answer questions about any of these papers. Thanks.